All right. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for coming. So in Leonard Davis's Enforcing Normalcy, he declares that there is a limit to what we can say about disabled characters in literature, that they are either villains who confirm our disgust or heroes who confirm our perseverance. Instead, he suggests that we look at disability, quote, in relation to social process and cultural production to lay bare the cultural assumptions at the very base of cultural artifacts, unquote. In other words, Davis asks us to look at the very structures dependent on normative bodies and standards. I adapt Davis's point to go beyond an analysis of characters representing certain attitudes toward disability to analyze the narrative function of disability, a logic of disablement. And what I mean by that is the way narratives respond to certain behaviors and traits so as to exclude and disable in service of some larger narrative aim. Texts respond to body-mind differences in predictable ways, but each text uses those responses for some rhetorical purpose. Rick Carpenter poses some questions to help uncover this purpose. Quote, how is disability being used within the text? What is disability doing? To what recurring condition or situation? What specific social action is it mediating, unquote? To which I add, what do we talk about when we talk about disability? I approach these questions through addiction and Charles Chestnut's 1901, The Marrow of Tradition, which shows conflicts between blacks and whites in a southern city that erupt in a race riot. I argue that the novel relies on disability as excess, E-X-C-E-S-S, even as it appeals to a moral model that disguises that reliance. I notice where disability isn't named in order to think through how disabling logics hide themselves. The novel presents excessive drinking and gambling as moral deviance, a cultural assumption that is often made toward addiction. This moral model links physical and mental differences with immorality. The narrative as a whole relies on this logic to frame racism as pathological, a corrupt marrow of white tradition that binds disability to the need to counter racism. In this way, disability produces signs that abstract arguments of racial equality lack. Racism harms whites as well as blacks. Disability mediates these effects through the idea of excess. Now, few disability scholars have seemed to explore addiction, especially in literary analysis. We see the same kinds of disabilities again and again: blindness, deafness, paralysis. In recent decades, we've seen more work on chronic illness, psychiatric disabilities, autism, but addiction rarely comes up, and especially not as an example of activism or disability pride as a form of diversity and identity rather than moral deviance. Perhaps because addiction doesn't seem to neatly fit into ideas of socially constructed or celebrated difference, although I can argue it can be, we ascribe the negative effects of addiction to the individual's behavior, not to social barriers or attitudes that constitute a disability. So, is addiction a disability? To answer this, we should think about what addiction is. I've been mentioning excess, and I would say that that is what distinguishes normal behavior from addiction when consumption transgresses from functional to pathological. Society condemns that excess as choice, though addicts understand their condition as the very impairment of choice. Thus, addiction is stigmatized excess, and the line between normal and excess is socially constructed, varying from individual to culture. Like any condition, addiction poses its own problems and issues, so it's not just like any other disability, but its absence from scholarship reflects the fact that dominant discourses so well disguise it as a social problem. According to Foucault, power relations work best when they are least noticeable. Quote, "Power is tolerable only on condition that it masks a substantial part of itself. Its success is proportional to its ability to hide its own mechanisms," unquote. Normative pressures to consume and deny the radical possibilities of excess refuse responsibility in creating or helping addicts. Davis says that addiction poses a challenge to neoliberal capitalism's reliance on choice and consumption, a threat that it seeks to subvert and hide. So addiction gets stigmatized or overlooked, and addicts don't get the help, the access to resources that they need. In the U.S., the cost of rehab programs, behavior therapy, and medication is often high, and many communities don't even offer these options. According to a New York Times study, 90% of addicts don't get treatment, and that is directly related to cultural discourses. As one doctor puts it, quote, "Referring to drug addicts as junkies or criminals keeps people with addiction in the shadows and away from treatment. They may be open to treatment, but they never seek it out," unquote. We have failed to address the power relations addicts are caught up with because we so want to believe in the power of choice and consumption. Jim Crow-era African-American writers like Chestnut extolled choice and stringent moral codes to refute late 19th century scientific racism's claims of inherent black inferiority and immorality. As Ryan Friedman explains, Chestnut's exposure of racist thinking, quote, "makes visible a particular linkage between the biological and the political," unquote. Chestnut attacks this linkage even as he maintains disability as a sign of pathology. Yet that pathology results from choice, a moral model. We can better notice how the moral model links choice with disability by examining the novel's use of excess. Tom Delamere, the grandson of a white aristocrat, drinks and gambles to excess, a degeneracy caused by racial and social privilege. He drinks until he passes out, missing social obligations, and gambles until his debts nearly ruin him. I read this stigmatized excess, which results in his loss of social ties and eventual exile, as addiction. His fiancée and her uncle scold him, but he continues in his behavior, getting worse even despite the increasing problems. And though rich, he only gets a small allowance from his grandfather, and so he accrues these vast gambling debts, and to get money for them, he ends up robbing and killing a white woman and framing his grandfather's black servant, Sandy, for the crime, and Sandy barely escapes being lynched for that crime. The narrative condemns Tom's excess as violence bound up with white aristocracy's exploitation of others. The logic of disablement presents a singular account of excess, one that confers moral deviance without considering that excessive drinking or gambling could be the result of impaired choice. Many addicts face similar social ostracism because of this moral stigma. What I'm saying is less a defense of Tom as a character than a point about the way the narrative uses excess to suggest that immoral choices are disabling. Chestnut wants readers to see that blacks can be respectable and whites immoral. This reversal uses a similar logic of degeneracy as racist and eugenics discourses of the time. Tom is a, quote, type of the degenerate aristocrat, a shadow without the substance, the empty husk without the grain, unquote. Like a parasite, Tom feels entitled to, quote, live upon others, the last privilege which aristocracy in decay would willingly relinquish, unquote. Tom's excess stands in for the excesses of racism, tying physical difference to moral violation. Okay? A similar logic runs throughout the novel. Described as poor white trash, Captain McBain's virulent racism stems from his missing eye, knocked out while beating a black woman. Tom's grandfather has a series of strokes, the last of which directly results from Tom's crimes. The black Dr. Miller encounters a colored sign in a segregated train car that reminds blacks not to lose sight of their disability. Even the fact that the riot culminates in the burning of the black hospital suggests a symbolic attack on the health of the black community. The narrative deploys each instance of physical difference to argue that racism is pathological excess. Remove it and you remove disability. Chestnut's stark exposure of lynchings and discrimination and attention to the psychology of whites makes his narrative a complex picture of racial conflict at the turn of the century. Certainly we need to account for the material effects of racism, which blacks, of course, would object to, and yet the novel reinforces the moral model that disability results from bad choices, condemning racial prejudice at the cost of blaming individuals for their disabilities. We may find the medical model dangerous, but I propose we need to be careful about moral claims, especially with vulnerable groups like addicts, many of whom are people of color. I hope that my analysis hints at a way we can talk differently about disability, think about addiction's role in literary and disability discourse, and uncover narrative logics that perpetuate the disabling idea that stigma is not only deserved, but freely chosen. Thank you.